identical with the shrinking of the autonomic nervous system, a protracted shock, as it were. For him, functional fever is not a figment of the imagination but a real, biophysically interpretable excitation of the biosystem. The distinction between animism and mysticism is important insofar as the argon physical motility of living substance can be differentiated from the animation of lifeless substance, equals animism, and the grotesque distortion of organ sensations, equals mysticism. For the mystic, a soul lives in the body. There is no connection between body and soul except for the fact that the soul influences the body, and vice versa. To the mystic, and to the mechanist, if he is aware of any emotional factors at all, body and soul are rigidly separated though interrelated realms. This is true for both psychophysical parallelism and mechanistic and psychologistic causal relationship, body rightward arrow psyche, or psyche rightward arrow body. Functional identity as a research principle of ergonomic functionalism is nowhere as brilliantly expressed as in the unity of psyche and soma, of emotion and excitation, of sensation and stimulus. This unity or identity as the basic principle of the concept of life excludes once and for all any transcendentalism or even autonomy of the emotions. Emotion and sensation are, and remain, bound to the argon physical excitation. This also excludes any mysticism. For the essence of mysticism lies in the concept of a supernatural autonomy of emotions and sensations. Hence, every concept of nature that is based on the autonomy of emotions, regardless of its own expressed views, is mystical. This is true for mechanistics, which cannot deny sensation although it would like to, and which cannot comprehend it, although it ought to. It is of course equally true for any kind of outspoken mysticism and especially for religious spiritualism. But it is also valid for psychophysical parallelism. Therefore, even psychoanalysis, unless it interprets the instinctual drives in terms of concrete, physiologically tangible excitations, is mystical. Furthermore, the sharp distinction between animism and mysticism results in a sharp distinction in the orientation of research. The animist proceeds from his own organ sensations, which tell him that organs are modal or alive or, which is the same thing, animated. Although the animist draws direct conclusions from personal experience, he cannot explain anything about the nature of sensation, movement, or animation. Movement is the direct experiential material that shapes the mental images of the newborn child. As long as the child possesses undistorted, naturally functioning organ sensations, he may falsely interpret what is static by animating it. But whenever the naturally perceiving child describes dynamic, living matter, he will judge correctly. If this function is continued later in natural research, it will conclude, as, for instance, Sigmund Freud did, that there is a psychic energy anchored in physical processes. This judgment is correct, for the psychic function is conceived as motion, and motion, in the strictest physical sense, is a shifting of energy. The discovery of cosmic argon energy proceeded after all from this correct, animistic interpretation. The study of the nature of sensation purely conceptually and experimentally led to the discovery of physical argon energy, which has specific biological functions. In contradistinction, the mystical concept of the dynamics of emotions can never lead to the discovery of physical energy processes, if only because, in principle, the mystic knows no connection between the physical and the emotional. In practice, mystical man, unlike the animistically thinking and feeling child, does not experience his organ sensations directly but always as if through a distorting mirror. The mystic may be able to describe argonatic currents and excitations, he may even give details that are astonishingly exact. But he will never be able to comprehend them quantitatively, any more than one can put the mirror image of a block of wood on the scales. Controlled clinical experience shows that there is always a wall between organ sensation and objective excitation in the mystic's structure. This wall is real. It is the muscular armor of the mystic. Any attempt to bring a mystic into direct contact with his excitation triggers anxiety or even unconsciousness. He can perceive the emotion in himself as in a mirror but not as a reality. This assertion is founded on an experience I had frequent occasions to observe. If argon therapy succeeds in dissolving the armor in the mystic, the mystical experiences disappear. Thus, the existence of a dividing wall between excitation and sensation is at the root of the mystical experience. The mystical experience is seldom found without concomitant brutal, sadistic impulses. Furthermore, to my knowledge, orgastic potency is not found among mystics, any more than mysticism is found among orgastically potent persons. Mysticism is rooted in a blocking of direct organ sensations and the reappearance of these sensations in the pathological perception of supernatural powers. This is true for the spiritualist, the schizophrenic, the religious physicist, and for any kind of paranoiac. If a mystical person tries to describe nature with the given preconditions of his character structure, he will only produce a picture of reality that, while reflecting real processes, is not in harmony with objective processes but is distorted, as, example, the paranoid schizophrenic's feeling of being influenced by electrical currents, the spiritualist's impression of a blue-gray nebulous ghost, the religious epileptic's fantasy of a universal spirit, or the metaphysician's idea of the absolute. Each of these impressions contains a part of the truth. The argonautic tingling sensations are the electric currents of the schizophrenic, the blue color of the argon is the blue-gray ghost of the spiritualist, the cosmic universality of argon energy is the universal spirit and the absolute concept of the mystical character. Thus, both the animist and the mystic touch upon a reality. The difference is the distortion of reality that becomes the absolute or the grotesque in mystical man, while animation of inanimate matter characterizes the animist. The claims of the mystics are quite transparent and easily refuted. The claims of the animists are hard to refute and more rationally comprehensible. The widespread and acknowledged view of the harmony of nature is basically an animistic view which, in the mystic, is degraded to a personified cosmic spirit or a divine universal being. The mystic is trapped in the absolute. The absolute is incomprehensible. The animist remains flexible, his views can be shifted. He has the advantage that his view of nature, contrary to the mystical view, contains a practicable core of truth. Even now, centuries later, the concepts of the animist Kepler, who formulated the planetary harmonic law, are still valid with respect to his vis animalis that moves the planets. The same energy that guides the movements of animals and the growth of all living substance indeed also guides the stars. The origin of all animistic and truly religious world philosophies must be sought in the functional identity of organismic and cosmic argon. Here we also find the rational core of animism and of genuine religiosity. We must liberate this rational core from its mystical guise strictly scientifically, in order to gain the intellectual raw material that leads us to the physical function of cosmic energy. By physical function we mean the ergonomic law of motion, which must be articulated in ergonometric terms. The poetic and philosophical equation of life sensation and cosmic function is correct but not sufficient to reconcile the human animal with nature. The human animal can learn to understand and love nature inside and outside himself only if he thinks and acts the way nature functions, namely, functionally, and not mechanistically or mystically. The world of ergonomic energetic functionalism is a vigorously functioning, free, and consequently lawful and harmonic world. It has no room for a vacuum in space, which the mechanistic physicist requires because he is incapable of making sense of nature in any other way, neither has it room for ghosts and phantoms, which mysticism cannot demonstrate. Also, the world of functionalism is not a shadow world, as is the world of the abstract mathematician. It is a world that is tangible, full, pulsating, and simultaneously demonstrable and measurable. The abstract mathematician does not realize that his formulas can describe objective processes only because his ideas are part of the same natural function that he expresses as abstract symbols. Anyone familiar with organ sensations is capable of tracing the sources from which the higher mathematician, without knowing it, derives his insight. Even if the functional symbols that he puts in place of the real world are unreal and do not even pretend to mirror reality, the creator of these functional symbols is unquestionably a vigorously pulsating organotic system who could not involve himself with mathematics if he did not pulsate. Higher mathematics could pose as the most sophisticated product in the development of natural science only because its anchoring in pulsating nature was not known or not admitted. The brain of the mathematician is not a differently organized instrument, it differs only insofar as it is capable of expressing organ sensations in mathematical form. The mathematical formula is thus only one means of expression among others, and not the magic wand it appears to be to the narrow mind of mystical man. It is the living organism that orders, regroups, and connects its sensations before articulating them as mathematical formulas. The Argonne biophysicist knows that in sleep one often finds solutions to problems one has tried to solve in vain while awake. I myself have worked out a whole series of functional equations during twilight sleep, which will have to be set forth in another context. I do not mind admitting this because I am not interested in the superiority of pure intellect over the emotions. I know furthermore that the human intellect is only the executive organ of the living plasm investigating and probing the world around us. Considered functionally, sensation is a feeling out of reality. The slowly groping, wavy movements of animal antennae or tentacles will illustrate what I mean. Sensation is the greatest mystery of natural science. Therefore, functionalism knows its worth and values it highly. Because he regards sensation as a tool, the functionalist is concerned with its care, just as a good carpenter cares for his plane. The functionalist will always order his intellectual activity so that it is in harmony with his sensations. Where the degree of emotional irrationalism is small, and it must be small for anyone who investigates nature, he listens to the gentle warnings of his sensations that tell him whether his thinking is right or wrong, clear or muddied by personal interests, whether he follows his irrational inclinations or any objective processes. All this has nothing to do with mysticism. It has to do exclusively with keeping our sensory apparatus, the tool of our research, in good condition. This condition is not a gift, not a special talent, but a continuous effort, a continuous exercise in self-criticism and self-control. We learn to control our sensory apparatus when we have to treat biopathic patients. Without an invariably clear system of sensation, without the ability to clear it if it becomes irrationally distorted, we would not be able to take one step into the depth of human character structure or describe natural processes as they are. Such observations and viewpoints in natural research, and man's emotional life is certainly a part of nature, are alien to the chemist, the physicist of the old school, the astronomer, and the technician. They do not know their sensory apparatus, with which they explore the world. They can control their actions only by experiment, and we know that experiment without organ sensation has taken mechanistic natural science nowhere in crucial questions of nature. The mechanistic technologist denies this, but the eminent physicist admits it. For us natural scientists, the life function has many meanings. First, it forms the basis of all life activity, including natural research. It is the port from which we set out on our investigative voyages and to which we return in order to rest, store up results, or pick up new provisions. Second, the life function is the tool with which we touch, probe, order, and comprehend ourselves and the nature around us. The German term begreifen literally means to feel out. The most important tool is sensation, be it inner organ sensation or outer sensory perception. Third, the life function is an object of our research. The first and most important object is, again, organ sensation both as a tool and as a natural phenomenon. By investigating how living matter functions, we also discover a part of external nature. For what is truly alive in us is itself a part of that external nature. Thus, if we proceed carefully in studying the material that constitutes the life function, we must also find those functions that have general, cosmic validity. This is a necessary and unavoidable conclusion inasmuch as the overall functioning principle is contained even in the smallest special functioning principle. In this way, the life function becomes for us a part of objective nature, the prototype for certain generally valid natural functions which originally have nothing to do with the living element per se. Offhand, a thundercloud has nothing in common with an amoeba. By observing certain functions in the amoeba, however, we succeed in reaching conclusions that are equally valid for the thundercloud. For instance, there is the attraction of highly charged thunderclouds upon smaller clouds, as compared to the attraction exerted by the amoeba on small bions. Such rigorously ordered and controlled natural research, such interconnections, are alien and often outrageous to the mechanist. Under no circumstances will he admit any connection between amoeba and cloud, and he will dismiss such ideas as humbug, charlatanism, or mysticism. Therefore, proceeding from the energy development in bions, he does not discover the same energy in the atmosphere. Therefore, as a meteorologist, he describes heat waves in the flickering atmosphere as one and the same phenomenon, even at -20 degrees Celsius. As an astronomer, he speaks of bad seeing and dispersed light in observing the stars at night, and, as electrophysicist, he speaks of static electricity in dealing with the atmosphere. No one would object, if only he did not believe he had solved all mysteries with the term ionized cosmic dust. His arrogance turns him into a conceptual roadblock in the field of natural research, and since the further development of the human race will be determined for centuries by its attitude toward nature inside and outside itself, and by nothing else, such ignorant arrogance also becomes a roadblock for any social development. The state of the world today speaks for itself. Functional thinking does not tolerate any static conditions. For it, all natural processes are in motion, even in the case of rigidified structures and immobile forms. It is precisely this motility and uncertainty in his thinking, this constant flux, which places the observer in contact with the process of nature. The term in flux or flowing is valid, without qualifications, for the sensory perceptions of the scientist observing nature. That which is alive does not know any static conditions unless it is subjected to immobilization due to armoring. Nature, too, flows in every single one of its diverse functions as well as in its totality. Nature, too, does not know any static conditions. Therefore, I believe that Bergson, in his brilliant formulation of the experience of continuum, made the mistake of describing the biopsychic process as metaphysics, in contrast to science and technology. Fundamentally, Bergson meant to say only one thing with his philosophy of nature: mechanistic natural science is correct in the realm of inorganic nature and technological civilization. It leaves us in the lurch if we are to comprehend the perceiving live organism and the act of natural research in the realm of biopsychic processes. Argonne research has left no doubt that mechanistic natural research has failed not only in the biopsychic realm but also in all other realms of nature where a common denominator of natural processes had to be found. For, as we said, nature is functional in all areas, and not only in those of organic matter. Of course, there are mechanical laws, but the mechanics of nature are in themselves a special variant of functional processes of nature. This remains to be proved. If we consistently want to follow the working hypothesis that argon energy is cosmic primordial energy per se, that the three large functional realms, of mechanical energy, dead mass, and living matter, spring from this cosmic primordial energy through complicated processes of differentiation, that, finally, cosmic primordial energy actually functions in a specific varied manner, we face the enormous task of deriving the specific variations from the common functioning principle of argon energy. We can do this in several ways. We can study argon energy in its natural functioning in the atmosphere and in the living organism, grasp the basic functional principles, and trace them to the higher variations. We can simultaneously, indeed, we must simultaneously comprehend the specific variations in and among the three large functional realms and connect them concretely in such a way that the common functioning principles of the higher order will lead us spontaneously to the common functioning basis of all nature. This has nothing to do with philosophy or natural philosophy. This task is comparable to that of an engineer who has to build a complicated bridge across a wide river. he must span both banks and construct the bridge in its entirety as well as connect the individual cement blocks. We differ from this engineer in that we cannot promise at what particular time the bridge will be ready. We do not know when the construction will be ended and who will carry it to completion. But in order to keep our perspective, we will have to direct our attention simultaneously to both banks and to those details of the construction that are indispensable for spanning the river. At this point, we do not have to think of the form and the material, the decorative touches, the arrangements for illuminating the bridge, etc. We have investigated cosmic argon energy in diverse functioning areas sufficiently to formulate several generally valid principles in the common functioning basis of all nature. Among these principles, we find pulsation as the basic characteristic of argon energy. It can be divided into two antithetical part functions, expansion and contraction, or synthesized from them. I realize that I am expressing myself mechanistically. But, for the duration of this study, it is necessary to isolate the function under investigation from the general flow of natural processes, even to let it rigidify, so we can examine it more closely. But under no circumstances should we translate a step, which we had to take because we could not operate otherwise, into an objective property of the function itself. We must not ascribe to nature any properties that are not inherent in it but are seen only at the moment of investigation. It is not pedantry or superfluous warning to say this. Mechanistic natural science is full of such misinterpretations. The mechanistic bacteriologist stains certain cocci and bacteria with specific biologically effective chemicals in order to make them more visible. Staphylococci react positively to the Gram stain, that is, they appear blue, tubercle bacilli appear red in eosin. The bacteriologist now speaks of the specific color reaction of bacteria as if it were a specific biological property of these microorganisms. This is inaccurate, because the staining is an artificial means of demonstrating the object, and not a specific quality of the microorganism. The cancer researcher of mechanistic orientation has consistently overlooked the true properties of cancer cells because he clings to the secondary, artificial properties that the cancer cells acquired in the process of examination. The mechanistic physicist says that light consists of 7 basic colors, that it is composed of them. The functionalist says, if I put a ray of light through a prism, it takes on the appearance of a 7-colored scale. Without prism or without a screen formed by rain, i.e., without any artificial interference, light is a unitary phenomenon that has its own specific qualities, such as illuminating a room. And let us not forget that we have not actually understood anything when we say illuminating. I can kill an animal and dissect it this way or that. No one would say that the animal consisted of the parts into which I have dissected it. This is especially true in criticizing any kind of mechanistic research. The experimental operation alters the object of research. The coloration of cancerous tissue blots out its living qualities. The dispersion of light through a prism merely indicates how light reacts under the influence of refraction, but not how light reacts without this influence. In wide areas, mechanistic natural science has fallen victim to the error of thinking that the altered qualities of a natural function are identical with its actual qualities. I explain nothing about the nature of a 2-year-old child if I let him make a pattern of triangles and squares. I only say something about the particular situation into which I have placed the child, i.e., how he reacts under this special condition. Things are different if I first observe the child in his natural environment. There the child creates his own conditions of life, he is not reacting to a condition created by me. Therefore, the direct observation of nature is more important than the experiment. To control my observations, I can organize my experiments in such a way that I study nature, and not my modifications of nature. I observe that, influenced by concentrated argon and water, plants will spontaneously grow better than they would in darkness or deprived of water. I act according to the natural conditions of growth if I experiment by irradiating seed with concentrated argon energy and then compare its growth with seed that has received less radiation or none at all. But if I expose the seed to a chemical solution with which it would never come in contact in nature, I have produced an artificial change of the seed's properties. My result may be useful, pointless, or even harmful. But I have not studied a natural process if I have produced experimental conditions that cannot be found in nature. A child does not by nature place square blocks into the corresponding holes, but plays with sand or earth. By nature, a cancerous cell is not gram-stained but has a natural color of its own. And, by nature, seed functions on the basis of organotic processes, and not on the basis of a surplus of potassium. Every kind of natural observation connects excitation as the cause with sensation as the result, or, conversely, sensation as cause and excitation as the result. That quantitative changes bring about qualitative changes, and vice versa, is a generally accepted fact, just as organic and inorganic life influence, condition, and change each other. Dynamic thinking is therefore no special characteristic of organomic functionalism. That natural processes influence cultural processes and that cultural processes change nature is a truism for all thought. By the same token, the interrelated functions of animals and plants, men and machines, males and females, science and art, electricity and mechanics, positive and negative electricity, acids and bases, feudalism and bourgeois existence, mathematics and music, intellect and emotion, thought and experience, etc., are known, recognized, understood, and coped with in practice. The basic difference between organomic functionalism and all other conceptual methods is that organomic functionalism not only sees an interrelation of functions but seeks a common, third, and deeper functional relation. From this logical and simple unification of two functions in a third and common functioning principle, it follows that, one in the course of progressive insight, all existing functions become simpler, and not more complicated. Here, organomic functionalism is in sharp opposition to all other conceptual methods. For the mechanist and the metaphysician, the complexity of the world increases in direct ratio to the increasing knowledge of facts and functions. For the functionalist, the natural processes become simpler, clearer, and more transparent. With the unification in a common functioning principle, there automatically emerges an orientation of research that presses for knowledge of still simpler and more comprehensive functioning principles. For instance, once we have recognized the common functioning principle in animal and plant, namely the bion, we will encounter, willy-nilly, further and more deeply rooted common factors, such as the common functioning of bions obtained from organic matter as compared to bions obtained from inorganic matter. In this way we acquire a viewpoint from which we can study organic and inorganic nature from one perspective. It is up to us to decide if we want to examine the special or the general, the diverse or the common, the variation or the basic. The variation has its own functional laws that differ from other variations. At the same time, the variation obeys the general functioning principle of its origin. In the investigation of the cancer biopathy, the functional viewpoint gained valuable confirmation. A cancer cell in animal tissue is very different from the amoeba in a grass infusion. Mechanistic research claims that the amoeba stems from germs in the air and that the origin of the cancer cell is unknown. Amoeba and cancer cell have remained two sharply differentiated areas, both without beginning or end or any transition to other areas. But organomic functionalism offered a rich mine of research in comparing cancer cell and amoeba. The common factors are more important than the differences. Cancer cell and amoeba develop through the natural organization of bions or energy vesicles. The cancer cell is the amoeba of animal tissue, and the amoeba is the cancer cell of plant tissue. Through the interconnection between amoeba and cancer cell, both of which disintegrate into bions in living tissue, a functional relationship is established which opens the previously closed gates to the investigation of the cancer cell and, with it, the disease of cancer. Schematically, this looks as follows: mechanistic thinking favors differences, usually overlooks the common, and therefore becomes rigid and sharply divisive. Functional thinking is principally interested in common features because the investigation of the common leads deeper and further. When Darwin studied the origin of man, derived from the higher animals, he considered it far more important that the embryos of man, pig, ape, and dog showed so many identical traits rather than any subtle differences. In this manner he found the common principle of evolution of the vertebrates, which is valid for man and ape. For mechanistics and mysticism, the difference between man and animal was, and still is, more important, example the non-animal or non-sexual being. We can discern why this divisive methodology was bound to lead to a finalistic and mystical dead end. The common traits are invariably pointing to a common origin. Therefore, the exploration of common functions of different phenomena is also historical and genetic exploration. The divisive observation, as exemplified in purely descriptive biology, cannot lead to genetic observation. Accordingly, the tendency arises to connect the variations with a common goal or purpose of their functions. This is how mysticism makes its way into natural science. And from the mysticism of divisive observation derive the irrational attitudes of racial prejudice or sexual suppression of infants. It is no accident, but supported by fact, that life-negating philosophy always emphasizes the divisive element, such as the differences among peoples in nationalism, the differences among families in family ideology, the differences of wealth in the financial principle, the differences of social rank in the authoritarian principle. On the other hand, life-asserting philosophy stresses the common element, the common biological origin of all human animals, the common features in man, animal, and nature, the common life interests and necessities, etc. Since functional thinking knows the motility of all processes, it is modal itself and always produces an abundance of evolutionary processes. But mechanistic thinking is, by definition, rigid and therefore has a rigidifying effect on the objective of its research, its education, its cure, its social effort. We deny conservatism not its goodwill but its ability to guide living reality. The mechanist cannot be anything but conservative or reactionary. He may regard his attitudes and intentions in whatever light he pleases, but the essence of his thinking is to overlook developments, to misunderstand or hate the living organism, and therefore to seek a substitute in rigid principles. The essence of life is to function, and therefore it is antagonistic to any rigidity. Nature knows no bureaucracy. Natural laws are functional, and not mechanistic. Even where the law of mechanistics is valid, nature abounds with variations. Functionalism is capable of solving contradictions, which seem insolvable to the mechanist, because it comprehends the common principle. To give a few examples, the mechanist cannot reconcile society and individual, not because he does not want to, but because he is unable to. Therefore, he will give priority to the interests of society or to those of the individual. While he knows that the interests of society are conditioned by gratifying the interests of the individuals, and vice versa, his thinking and acting are invariably a question of either/or. This produces the sharp contrast between state and individual, which in this form is insolvable and irreconcilable. In the sharp juxtaposition of religion and sexuality we face another example of divisive mechanistic thinking. For the mechanist and the mystic, religion and sexuality are irreconcilable. This is carried to such extremes that, to the Catholic, sexual pleasure is regarded as a sin even in a marriage sanctified by the Church. The functionalist resolves this contradiction as follows. The common principle of sexuality and religion is the sensation of nature in one's own organism. When natural sexual expressions were repressed in the human animal during the development of patriarchy, this produced a severe, unbridgeable contradiction between sexuality as a sin and religion as a liberation from sin. In primitive religion, religion and sexuality were one, argonautic plasma excitation. In patriarchy, argonite becomes sin on the one hand and God on the other. The functionalist understands the identity of emotions in sexuality and religion, the origin of the estrangement and the dichotomy it created, the fear of sexuality among religious people, and the pornographic degeneracy among the excommunicated. The mechanist and the mystic are a product of this contradiction, remain trapped in it, and perpetuate it. The functionalist breaks through the barriers of this rigid contradiction by finding the common features in emotion, origin, and nature. Transgressing the rigid barriers the mechanist has drawn in nature initially takes the functionally thinking scientist to uncertain ground. Mechanistic rigidity in observation and theory formation serves one's personal security far more than it does objective exploration. I have experienced time and again, both in myself and in many of my co-workers, that clinging to rigid barriers and laws has the function of sparing us psychic disquiet. Strangely enough, by letting the modal element rigidify, we feel less threatened than we do in exploring a modal object. One of my assistants who came to me from a biological laboratory reported that she had received strict orders covering her research work. She was not allowed to go beyond certain limits or step into areas outside the research program. I realize that such rules rest on the trend of the neurotic character structure to slip into arbitrariness and lack of discipline in thought and work. But I also realize that such rules preclude true research. The bacteriologist, for instance, is so hemmed in by the barriers of sterilization that he forgets that nature is not sterile and that we must also explore processes of putrefaction. We will see in another context that for several decades cancer research overlooked the simple fact of putrescent cancerous organisms because the limits of sterilization were not allowed to be crossed. It is now clear that one becomes uncertain in working with unsterile preparations. But this uncertainty is an essential exercise of balanced thinking. The results produced by sterile facts must be compared with unsterile facts. This is more difficult but also more constructive. It reduces prejudice and brings us closer to reality. The exploration of nature by experiment was a decisive step forward toward objective observation. But the mechanistically conducted experiment has separated the observer from direct observation. The distrust of man, including his power of judgment and the rationality of his emotions, is so enormous and rightly so that the objective experiment became top-heavy. One felt averse to both examining live tissues and observing the atmosphere with the naked eye. Objective experiments, such as Michelson's light experiment, which did away with the ether, have had catastrophic consequences for natural research. It is possible to control the living observer by the experiment, but it is not possible to replace him. An observer, who because of his character structure works and thinks mechanistically, cannot improve his performance by experiments. Hence, it was always the rebel against mechanistics in natural science who transcended the sharp borders and made his discoveries precisely because he was so unorthodox. He simply returned to direct observation and to the natural, i.e., functional, interrelations of these observations. These rebels of natural science were also rebels in thinking. They functioned in an alive manner, stepped across barriers, broke down walls, as in the question of the unchangeability of chemical substances, the relations between energy and mass, the relations between man and animal, etc. Just think of what psychology has accomplished on the basis of these same observations. The functionalist uses the experiment to confirm his observations and the results of his thinking. He does not replace thought and observation by experimentation. The mechanist does not trust his thinking and observation, and he is right. The functionalist does trust his senses and his thinking. He differs from the mystic and the religious believer by knowing his uncertainties and controlling them experimentally. He differs from the mechanist by including everything in his observation, by regarding everything as possible, by breaking down the barriers between the sciences because he comprehends their interconnections, and by steadily and consistently progressing toward the simpler functioning principle. The mechanistic scientist is so unsure of himself, his operations are so complicated and entangled in trivial detail having no relation to the whole, that he rejects results a priori as inaccurate merely because they are simple. The argon accumulator was dismissed by eminent persons because it is only a simple metal box. The mechanistic human structure has a low tolerance for uncertainties, avoids prolonged tensions caused by uncertainty, does not care for the flowing and intermeshing of functions in nature. Added to this is the fear of life itself, which will be discussed in another context. By breaking down all barriers erected by the mechanist against nature, By differentiating common functions from specific variations, the functionalist reduces diverse facts to functional interconnections, the functions to energy processes, and the various energy processes to a generally valid functional law of nature. It is unimportant how much he actually accomplishes at any given time in practice or in theory. What is important is the orientation toward research in the observation of nature. And this orientation, simplification and unity versus complexity, depends on the structure of the scientist. The mechanistic viewpoint fails when we try to find the transition from organotic excitation of the human organism to the processes in the tissues of its organs. The visible spasms and the subjective sensations of current imply that they correspond to concrete processes in the tissue substance. Mechanistics is unable to tell us how we might confirm or control our justified assumption. The processes in human tissues are not immediately observable. Post-mortem dissection and coloration of the tissue do not explain anything about the processes in their living state because dead and dying tissue are fundamentally different from live tissue. The reports of mechanistic pathology are taken from dead tissues that are further changed by staining, therefore, they bypass what is alive and go astray. Also, mechanistics presupposes innervations of tissue functions in man and the higher animals, which are supposed to arise not in the tissues themselves but in the higher centers. In this way, nothing can be gained by observing primitive plasmatic organisms even if they are accessible to microscopic observation. An amoeba has no nerves and, consequently, no innervations that, from the mechanistic viewpoint, would correspond to those of the higher animals. This is how mechanistic pathology automatically excludes any comparative observation. Functionalism has freed itself from these prejudices and their rigid limitations. The thought technique of the functionalist connects the animal tissue with the tissue of the protozoan because, in principle, all living substance must be functionally identical. Once the idea of this identity is accepted, there are many experimental possibilities for answering the question, do the organotic sensations, which are so familiar to the psychiatrist trained in argon therapy, have a real, observable basis in animal tissue? Let us observe flowing amoebae. We see currents in the protoplasm which, when pleasurably stimulated, are directed toward the periphery, and which retreat to the center when unpleasurably stimulated. In other words, the amoebae stretch out toward pleasurable stimulation and recoil when unpleasurably stimulated. Here, with one stroke of a simple observation and a sound theory, a solid bridge is built from the multicellular organism to the amoeba. The amoeba behaves exactly as we could have predicted the emotional behavior of the human animal on the basis of our clinical observations. What we discern psychiatrically in man, we observe directly in the amoeba, the flow of protoplasm that has emotional significance. Our theory tells us, what we subjectively perceive and what we call organ sensations are objective movements of protoplasm. Organ sensations and plasmatic currents are functionally identical. With regard to the functions of pleasurable expansion and anxious contraction of protoplasm, man and amoeba are functionally identical. We let amoebae die off. Their protoplasm gradually loses its motility until it stops altogether. Death has occurred. After dying, the protoplasm disintegrates into tiny bodies that we know so well as T-bodies from examining cancerous tissues. The microscopic processes in protozoa have put us on the track of degeneration in the tissues of cancer patients. More than that, if we follow the organization of protozoa from bionously disintegrating grass tissue, we find the key to the origin of cancer cells in disintegrating human tissue. The microscopic observations remain in harmony with our clinical observations. Tissue disintegrates into bions and then into tiny T-bodies when it loses biological energy, i.e., when it becomes anorganotic. This can be studied under the microscope. These observations correspond to the diminishing life activity in the cancerous organism, the loss of tissue, the typical stale or putrescent odor, the low motility, the resigned character attitude, etc. All this points to steadily progressive argon loss in the organism. I believe that very few findings of classical medicine rest on such a congruity of diverse facts. Added to this is the existence of argon energy in the atmosphere. Concentrated in accumulators, this energy is capable of stopping anorganic processes in the sick organism and reversing them. Anorgonia of the blood in cancer patients can be cured by argon therapy. The organism feels strengthened, it develops stronger impulses, gains weight, etc. We see that the functional interrelation of facts from different, widely separated areas, achieved by different investigative methods but subordinated to one theoretical principle, is no witchcraft or magic but a technique of thinking that can be learned. Helped by this conceptual technique, we can bridge wide gulfs that up to now have gravely impeded biological and medical research. It is primary biological movement, i.e., the primary emotion, which in a simple manner combines living substance of various organizational strata into one. In principle, we have become independent from nerve paths and specific glands because we have put the problem where it belongs, in the foundation of living functioning. Not matter or structure but motion and energy processes are the guidelines of our conceptual technique. Since substances and structural forms are endlessly complicated, while primitive movements and energy processes of life are extremely simple and accessible to observation, we have gained a new and hopeful perspective. At this point, it is the very simplicity of our clinical and experimental perspective that separates us from our colleagues working with chemical substances and structures in mechanistic pathology. Today, simplicity lacks credibility, even if it no longer seems unscientific, as it did several years ago. I know that the comparison of an amoeba with a man must appear strange to complicated thinking. But I insist that the rigid barrier erected by mechanistic cancer research between the protozoan in grass infusion and the cancer cell in animal tissue strikes me as far stranger. Scientific research methods prove their accuracy not only by the facts they reveal but also by the new research fields they open up. The mechanistic separation of cancer cell and protozoan has led us nowhere. On the contrary, for decades it has condemned cancer research to sterility. This happened in the name of a prejudice of religious mystical origin. The units of living matter are cells, and the cells are forever perpetuated from cells. This prejudice gave rise to the erroneous idea that the cancer cell was merely a degenerate body cell. The cancer cell has nothing in common with the healthy cell, except that it develops from the decayed matter of formerly healthy cells. In contradistinction, the functional connection between the cancer cell and the protozoan in decaying grass tissue has opened the gates to further cancer research. With this basic attitude and thought technique we are spared fruitless discussion about the biochemical results of classical biology. They are of secondary importance for understanding living matter and, with it, the cancer biopathy. An example from the field of mechanistics, which is more familiar to the mechanistic thinker, may illustrate what we mean. A railroad train consists of a number of cars drawn by a locomotive. The cars are made of metal, wood, glass, etc. The locomotive houses a firebox, a steam boiler, levers, pistons, etc. No matter how much we say about wood, metal, glass, levers, etc., no matter how closely we analyze them in detail, the most exact investigations, carried on ad infinitum, would still not tell us anything about the function of a railroad train. Its one and only function is to move in toto and to take me from New York to Boston. If I want to understand the railroad train, I must understand the principle of its motion. The material construction of its locomotive and cars is unimportant and of secondary interest. It is perhaps of interest for the comfort and safety of the journey, but not for the principle of traveling. Now classical biology examines the structures of living matter in its infinite variations down to the smallest detail. It may produce results of great sophistication, but it will never be able to say anything about the nature of living matter. We are dealing with more than questions of biology. The discovery of the argon far transcends the realm of living matter, even if it stemmed from this realm and found its most important application therein. As we said, the discovery of the argon must essentially be attributed to a complicated but consistent thought technique. This thought technique was confirmed by the findings it made, and by the development of experiments that secured the argonomic findings. the description of this act of thought becomes an integral part of understanding life itself. In it, life understands its own essence. I say, in the act of thought, life comprehends its own essence. This is true for the functions of both inorganic and organic nature. In building a machine, man grasps the laws and functions of non-living nature in its relation to living requirements. In the sciences concerning man, the living organism seeks to understand the functions of life itself. However, it always understands only what it experiences in itself. If what is alive in the human animal had not become armored and degenerate because of the mechanical mystical principle, the result of mastering living nature would be in harmony with actual life functions. It would have mastered the material structures of living substance side by side with the laws of motion of the living organism. Owing to the social tragedy that struck the human animal thousands of years ago in the form of mechanical mystical degeneration, it had access only to its mechanistic functions, to the structure of the skeleton, to the muscles, the blood vessels and nerves, the chemical composition of the organism, etc. Since the modal aliveness in man was armored and therefore inaccessible, the life principle itself, the motion, i.e., actually the most essential feature of life, remained a closed book. What the rigid mechanist could not accomplish because he regarded life merely as an especially complicated machine, the mystic has tried to supplement. The motility of life was transferred into the beyond, allegorically in theory and so often literally in practice whenever rigidified human animals went to war against one another. Because armored man is rigidified, he thinks predominantly in terms of matter. He perceives motion as being in the beyond or as supernatural. This must be taken literally. Language always expresses the immediate condition of organ sensations and offers an excellent clue to man's self-awareness. Movement, i.e., plasmatic current, is indeed inaccessible to the rigidified human animal. It is therefore beyond, i.e., beyond his ego perceptions, or supernatural, i.e., felt as an eternal cosmic longing beyond his material being. What the armored organism perceives as mind or soul is the motility of life that is closed to him. He sees and feels the motion only as in a mirror. He describes the motility of life correctly, but only in the sense of a correct mirror image. A large part of the brutality of the mystic is explained by the simple fact that while he feels life inside himself, he can neither experience it in reality nor develop it. Hence the impulse develops to conquer the mirror image by force, to make it tangible and palpable by force. The life in the mirror is a constant provocation that drives him into a frenzy. There it is, this motility, it lives, laughs, cries, hates, loves, but always only in a mirror. In reality it is as barred to the ego as the fruits were out of reach for Tantalus. From this tragic situation springs every murderous impulse directed against life. Mechanistics and mysticism combine to form a sharply divided image of life, with a body consisting of chemical substances here, and a mind or soul there, mysterious and unexplorable, inaccessible as only God himself. The unarmored organism, however, experiences the self mainly as a unity in motion. Its organ sensations tell it that the essential part of life is not substance. Basically and in terms of matter, a corpse looks no different than a living body. Until putrefaction sets in, the chemical composition is the same. The difference lies in the absence of motion. Therefore, the corpse is alien, even terrifying, to living sensation. Spontaneous motion is thus what is alive. We now understand the hopelessness of all mechanistic mystical thinking. It constantly collides with the armor of its own organism without ever being able to penetrate it. Unarmored life, however, will find, interpret and comprehend expressions of life in its own movements. Motion is its essence, structure is important, but not basic. Therefore, the biology of the unarmored organism must necessarily differ radically from the biology of armored life. The mechanist does not understand the principle of human organization. He does not know the properties of argon energy, and therefore, unless he remains purely descriptive, he is forced to introduce a metaphysical principle. For him, there is a hierarchy of organs in the body. The brain as the highest product of development, together with the nervous system in the spine, directs the whole organism. Mechanistics postulates a center from which all impulses proceed to set the organs in motion. Communicated through the corresponding nerve, every muscle has its own center somewhere in the brain or midbrain. How the brain itself receives its assignments remains a riddle. The organs are the well-behaved subordinates of the brain. The nerves are the telegraph wires. Hence the coordinated movement of the organism remains nebulous and mysterious. Where understanding fails, purpose sets in, the convenient in order to. The muscles of the shoulders and arms of the apes coordinate their movements in order to grasp. To my knowledge, a center for the coordination has not been assumed or found. And it would not improve the situation, because the question of who gives the assignments to the center would still be unresolved. Since the mechanist does not understand the living organism, he must resort to mysticism. Therefore, all mechanistic philosophy is, and invariably must be, mystical as well. Mechanistic thinking itself is clearly made in the structural image of social patriarchy when it regards the brain as the master, the nerves as the telegraph wires, and the organs as obedient executive subjects. And behind the brain there is God, or reason or purpose. The situation in the scientific comprehension of nature remains as hopelessly confused as ever. In functionalism, there is no higher center and no lower executive organ. The nerve cells do not produce the impulses, they merely communicate them. The organism as a whole forms a natural cooperative of equivalent organs with different functions. If natural work democracy is biologically founded, we find it modeled after the harmonious cooperation among the organs. Multiplicity and variety are fused into unity. Function itself regulates cooperation. Every organ lives for itself, functions in its own realm on the basis of its own functions and stimuli. The hand grasps and the gland secretes. The individual organs are independent beings endowed with their own sensation and function. Experiments with the isolated heart and muscle have unequivocally confirmed this. Sensation is by no means tied to sensory nerve endings. All plasmatic matter perceives, with or without sensory nerves. The amoeba has no sensory or motor nerves, yet it perceives. Each organ has its own mode of expression, its own specific language, so to speak. Each organ responds to stimulation in its own specific way, the heart with change in heartbeat, the gland with secretion, the eye with visual impressions and the ear with sound impressions. The specific expressive language of an organ belongs to the organ and is not a function of any center in the nervous system. In confronting these two basic views of the organism, we clearly recognize the difference between unarmored and armored living matter. Each derives its judgments from the organ sensations of its own body. The unarmored organism grasps directly with its hands. The concert pianist does not give orders to his hands. The hands, in conjunction with the whole organism, are the moving and movable self-acting organs. One hears with the whole organism, not just with the ear. The will is not the automobile. One travels by car, not by wheel. The armored organism, on the other hand, perceives the self as consisting of isolated parts. Every impulse must penetrate the armor. From this, the feeling of you should or you must arises, as well as the idea that the organism has a higher center that gives orders to the executive organs. In addition, there is the sensation of heaviness, inertia, or even paralysis in the limbs and the torso, which gives credence to the idea that an organ must act and be moved by an order. By the same logic, there is an ego behind all this, an intellect, a higher reason, which guides, assigns, etc. From here to the political concept of human society or, conversely, from the concept of the absolute state to the mechanistic concept of the organism is only one step. This is the way the armored organism developed and still develops its concept of living processes. Furthermore, the divisive idea of its organs and sensations makes it unable to find functional connections, which explains how brain mythology dominated the natural sciences for decades without anyone ever realizing that billions of organisms functioned for untold millennia before there ever was a brain. In addition to the splitting up of organ sensations, there is the mortal terror of total pulsation, of spontaneous motion and spontaneous excitation. This anxiety constitutes the actual break. If the splitting up process prevents the functional unity of the individual functions, the anxiety produces terror or rage in the armored organism whenever another person fills and connects the gaps, comprehends functional unity, or creates it. For these reasons, classical biology did not progress beyond the cell and did not find the simple path toward proving that cells are organized from bions and decompose into bions at death. The armored organism is characterized mainly by its inability to perceive and feel motion, i.e., living functioning, and therefore to comprehend it. What is usually called the rigidity or conservatism of traditional science is in reality marked by this inability and fear on the part of prominent scientists, who are then imitated by a multitude of minor ones. We know many examples of such dogmas: the indestructibility of the atoms, the division of matter and energy, omnis cellula ex cellula, etc. A great deal has been written on these subjects. But here, for the first time, these dogmas are successfully understood and, thereby, shaken. Many other dogmas will be destroyed in the further development of functional thinking. Unquestionably, the most important distinction between armored and unarmored organotic systems is the development of destructive sadism in the former. Since, in the armored organism, every plasmatic current and organotic excitation, in reaching for contact, runs into a wall, an irrepressible urge develops to break through the wall no matter by what circumstances or means. In so doing, all life impulses are converted into destructive rage. The organism tries to break through the armor by force, as if it were imprisoned. I seriously believe that in the rigid, chronic armoring of the human animal we have found the answer to the question of his enormous destructive hatred and his mechanistic mystical thinking. We have discovered the realm of the devil. Chapter 6: Cosmic Argon Energy and Ether. It is not our objective here to prove the existence of an all-pervading ether, neither is it intended to prove the identity of the cosmic argon energy and the postulated ether. All that is to be established at this point is the fact that there exists an all-pervading, observable, and demonstrable energy. It is filling gaps in the comprehension of the universe, gaps that many generations of physicists and philosophers tried hard, but in vain, to fill with the concept of an all-pervading ether as the primal substratum of the basic functions in nature. The time in which cosmic argonomic functions have been studied is very short. It comprises not more than a decade. However, all observations within this short period have led to the following conclusion: there is no such thing as empty space. There exists no vacuum. Space reveals definite physical qualities. These qualities can be observed and demonstrated, some can be reproduced experimentally and controlled. It is a well-defined energy that is responsible for the physical qualities of space. This energy has been termed cosmic argon energy. First, let us summarize the general conclusions that follow from the fact that there is no empty space, and, second, let us summarize the phenomena that have forced upon us the conclusion that the primordial cosmic energy, hitherto postulated as the ether, has been finally discovered in a practical and concrete manner, accessible to direct observation and experimentation. 1. All physical theories resting on the assumption of empty space tumble if, and only if, the abstract mathematical structures that were to replace the concrete physical qualities of space cannot be reconciled with the new factual observations. 2. The qualities that characterize space must be of a strictly physical nature, observable and reproducible in high vacuum. 3. The theoretical supposition of an ether continues to be valid. The phenomena in the vacuum must agree with the qualities that had to be ascribed to the ether in order to explain the functions of field actions in space, such as gravity, light, attraction at a distance, transmission of heat from the sun to the earth, etc. 4. The negative result of the Michelson-Morley experiment, which was designed to demonstrate the ether, must be comprehended. The premises that led to the performance of the Michelson-Morley experiment rest on incorrect assumptions. Argon physics starts from entirely new observations and new theoretical assumptions. Seen from a basic argonomic viewpoint, reasoning itself must be understood as a function of nature in general. Accordingly, the results of mere reasoning must be secondary to observable functions of nature. As functionalists, we are mainly interested in the observable functions of nature. From there, we arrive at the functions of human reasoning by way of the emotional, bioenergetic, functions within observing man. As long as observable nature does not constitute the starting point for human reasoning, and, furthermore, as long as the function of reasoning itself is not deduced in a logical and consistent manner from observable functions of nature within the observer, all results of mere reasoning unsupported by observations are open to basic methodological and factual questions. This is clearly shown in the conclusion drawn by mere reasoning from the negative outcome of the Michelson experiment. Though I must leave a thorough critical evaluation of this experiment to the physicists, who are at home in the realm of its premises, the following remarks may be justified on the basis of some observations in argon physics. A. One of the premises of the Michelson experiment was the assumption that the ether is at rest. The Earth, accordingly, moves through a stationary ether. This assumption is clearly proven incorrect by observation of the atmospheric argon. If the ether represents a concept pertaining to the cosmic argon energy, it is not stationary, but moves more rapidly than the globe of the Earth. The relation of the Earth's sphere to the surrounding cosmic argon ocean is not that of a rubber ball rolling on stagnant water, but of a rubber ball rolling on progressing water waves. Thus the first assumption of the Michelson experiment becomes invalid. B. Argonomic observations make it essential to separate, within the function of light, the lumination from the excitation, which is propagated through space with the speed of light. Light, accordingly, does not move at all but is a local effect of argon lumination. Thus the second premise of the Michelson experiment becomes invalid, if one accepts as one is forced to do the clear-cut argonomic observations in nature. I refer here to the argonomic lumination effect in high vacuum, to the phenomena of dawn, to the aurora borealis, to the corona of the Sun, the luminating ring of Saturn, etc. If light is due to local argon lumination and does not travel through space at all, it is quite understandable that in the Michelson experiment no phase difference could be observed in the light beams which were sent in the direction of the ether drag and perpendicular to it. 5. The physical functions in the vacuum must not contradict any cosmic functions at the basis of the planetary motions. On the contrary, they must, in due time, lead to an integration of the function of the primordial cosmic energy with the motions of the heavenly bodies. 6. There must be definite reasons why generations of physicists and astronomers have failed to demonstrate the ether in the strict sense of physical functions. These reasons are to be found in the functioning of the observer and in the method of human thinking itself. We shall now proceed to summarize the more important functions that have been observed and demonstrated in what I termed cosmic argon energy since its discovery in Bionis matter in 1936 and in the atmosphere in 1940. One form of existence: certain argon energy functions can be demonstrated wherever man is capable of directly observing nature and of setting up the appropriate instruments that react to these energy functions, example thermometer, electroscope, Geiger counter, magnifying glass, darkroom lined with sheet iron, and living organisms, be they protozoa or cancerous mice, anemic human beings, or proteus-bacilli. Argon energy can be demonstrated everywhere since it is present everywhere. Accordingly, it penetrates everything, though at varying rates of speed. No arrangement has yet been found by means of which one functioning realm of mass-free argon energy can be distinctly delineated from another, as one electric line can be sharply delineated from another. Therefore, we must comprehend a living organism as an organized part of the cosmic argon ocean, which possesses special qualities called living. We fail to understand this organism bioenergetically if we adhere to the mechanical energy potential. This mechanical potential, be it thermical, electrical or mechanical motion, is always directed from the higher to the lower, or from the stronger to the weaker system, and never vice versa. On the other hand, the living organism would not only not be able to keep up a much higher energy level as compared with the environment, it would also lose its heat, its motility, its energy into the surrounding, energetically lower, environment in a very short time. And the question would remain unanswered how it came about that such an organism could come into being in the first place. We cannot get around the fact that there is in nature another energy function, our so-called reversed, argonomic potential. Argon energy flows from the weaker or lower to the stronger or higher system. This not only agrees with the basic functions of living organisms, but also can be directly observed in non-living nature, example the function of gravity or the growth of clouds in the sky. The argonomic potential does not contradict the old mechanical potential. In fact, it explains how it is possible that a higher energy level can exist at all. It is true that, in accepting this function, the second law of thermodynamics, the absolute formulation of the law of entropy, becomes invalid. We know that many physicists feel uncomfortable with this law anyhow. And we have had to abandon many other such beliefs of absolute nature, example the conservation of matter or the unchangeability of chemical elements. The argonomic concept of energy functions in the living organism as it emerged from observation and deduction is the following. 1. The living organism, as the stronger energy system, draws its energy from the lower energy level, argonomic potential. This is valid not only for the organism as a whole, but for the nucleus in each living cell, which draws energy from the surrounding, energetically lower protoplasm. Diagram of the argon energy metabolism in living bodies 2. Each type or species of organism possesses its specific energy level, it has a special argonautic capacity. Otherwise, the living organism would not stop accumulating energy and would burst or grow indefinitely. 3. All surplus of energy is discharged according to the mechanical potential, from the higher to the lower level, in mechanical movement, in orgastic convulsions, in radiation of heat, etc. 4. There exists, accordingly, an argon energy metabolism, a continuous exchange of energy in the cohesive unit called organism. To summarize its main functions: maintenance of a certain capacity level by means of charging from the surrounding argon ocean and from foodstuffs, and by energy discharge into the surrounding energy ocean. The lower the capacity level, the weaker the capacity for charge, as in the shrinking biopathy. In the dying organism, the capacity to charge and to maintain the level of functioning is slowly lost. The capacity level sinks until it reaches the level of the surrounding argon ocean. In the putrefaction process after death, the opposite of what went on during original growth occurs. The material tissues lose their cohesion due to loss of argon energy, they fall apart. Finally the unit disintegrates into bions and then into rot bacteria, Proteus bacilli, etc. The main characteristic of argon energy appears to be motion and, with it, metabolism. There exists such a thing as stoppage of argon energy motion as, for instance, in severe cases of anorgonia. Such stoppage leads inevitably to a lowering of the capacity level and thus to final disintegration of the argon unit called organism, as in death. I have been told that disintegration due to lack of argon metabolism also occurs in wooden buildings that remain uninhabited over long periods of time. If we could find the reason why the capacity level of argon systems is lowered after a certain period of functioning, aging, we would be able to approach in a practical manner the problem of how to lengthen life. Argon energy is present everywhere, and it forms an uninterrupted. This continuum varies in different places with regard to its denseness or concentration. We are still using these mechanical terms borrowed from the language of the physics of matter, although argon energy is not of a material nature. Therefore, we must be prepared to replace these terms with others that are more fitting to describe the functions of argon energy. Argon penetrates all space, including space occupied by solid matter. It penetrates a wall of cement just as it does a wall of steel. The difference lies in the speed of penetration. Cement absorbs and discharges argon energy slowly, steel attracts argon energy strongly and quickly, but it also reflects it instantly, since metal seems incapable of holding argon energy. This fact may have some bearing on the function of rapid energy flow through metal wires. Continuum. 2. Movement. The physical functions abstracted in argon physics as argon energy are always and everywhere in motion, or, expressed differently, moving. To this date, it has been impossible to ascertain an argonautic condition that, with reference to another particular system, could be defined as immobile or unchanging. A rock, which, in the physical sense, represents a certain material variation of the cosmic argon energy, can be described as resting with reference to a second rock next to it. The argon energy, however, which can be physically demonstrated in the rock, is never resting with regard to the same frame of reference. Can the basic law of the conservation of energy be reconciled with the existence of an argonomic potential? It probably can. A first tentative suggestion to this effect is offered in the following assumption: while some argon units are forming in the argon ocean by concentration, others terminate their single existence by energy dissipation into the argon ocean. Thus, the energy lost by discharge or deaths of a number of argon units would be picked up again to be concentrated in other units. The running down of the universe toward random functions would in this way be counteracted by new births of high energy potentials due to reversed concentration, creation. The argonomic, reversed, potential would make entropy unnecessary. Argon energy is basically of a dynamic, metabolic nature. This would seem to be true for any kind of energy, since energy is a function of motion, and vice versa. But classical physics speaks of potential energy as, for instance, that contained in water in a high basin. Nothing of the kind can be found in argon energy. It never shows any condition that could be called static or immobile, except in its form of solid matter. It is this dynamic character of argon energy that underlies the functionalism of all known argon phenomena. This is true even for mechanical manifestations such as the sinus wave or free fall. Therefore, movement, dynamics, functionalism, changeability constitute specific, i.e., inseparable qualities of the cosmic argon energy. Within the framework of this motility, we can, by means of observation and experiment, discern many different kinds of motion. Wavy motions. We can clearly see wavy, rhythmic motions over smooth water surfaces of mountain lakes and in the sky. This motility, too, is not uniform but varies continuously. There are no two parts of the surface of a lake that would have an equal motion at one and the same time. In addition, the wavy motion shows different rhythms at different times. The oscillations constantly embrace different areas. We search in vain for a mechanically uniform, static motion, or condition. There is nothing within the realm of primal argonautic functions that would appear as mechanical repetition. There seems to exist no law at all except the one of pulsation. All wavy motions of the primordial argon energy pulsate. It is necessary to distinguish the wavy form of argon motion from its pulsation. The pulsation differs from the wavy motion in that 1. Pulsation consists of alternatingly expanding and contracting movements, while the wave is a steady progression of wave crests and wave troughs. 2. In pulsation, the medium, example the water in the lake, seems to move from a certain center in all directions to and fro, while in waves the water swings up and down, thus marking the crests and the troughs of the progressing waves that run over the water's surface. 3. The pulsatory motion on the lake's surface moves slowly from west to east or not at all, while the waves run much faster in the same direction. 4. Pulsation is an essentially discontinuous process, while wave motion is a continuous process. 5. Pulsation is a function in 3 dimensions of space as manifested in the sphere-shaped propagation of radio signals. Waves, on the other hand, are, if examined singly, 2-dimensional functions defined by wavelength and frequency only. If we follow the path of a certain wave crest or wave trough, we obtain a continuous line. The waveform itself is a continuous line. However, following the positions of extreme expansion or contraction in the pulsatory function, we obtain points and not a line. Through observation of the motion of atmospheric argon at mountain tops, we can clearly discern pulses and waves. The pulsatory peaks are superimposed on the course of the waves in the following manner: schematic presentation of the differences between pulses, P, and waves, W. My attention was first called to this basic difference between P and W in 1935 when I measured and photographed bioenergy at the skin surface. It was not until 1948 that I understood the inner functional interrelation between pulses and waves in the argonautic system. This was made possible by utilizing argonautic pulses in setting a spinner type of motor into rotary motion. Point 1. In the original observation, the pulses P were superimposed on the wavy motion of the organismic argon energy like mountain peaks on a mountain range, whereas in the mechanism of a radio transmitter the pulsatory signals are, according to the theory, transformed into waves synchronically. The pulses of the heartbeat are not synchronized with the rhythm of the argon waves. The pulses are distributed regularly while the waves are in a state of constant change. This is true for the living organism as depicted in the sketch above. It also seems to be true for the motion of the atmospheric argon. From now on, we shall designate the symbol P for pulses and the symbol W for waves. These distinctly separate functions of the one basic function of pulsation, P, will later be studied thoroughly in certain argonometric functions. They express a most important relationship between discontinuous, P, and continuous, W, functions of nature. We shall have to find out how and to what extent these functions are related to Planck's quanta, discontinuum, and to classical wave mechanics, continuum. As a preliminary measure, we may try to coordinate P, W, and P functionally in the following manner. Thus, pulsation would constitute the common functioning principle of both pulses and waves, the two varied functions of pulsation. It will require elaborate functional deductions to derive the energy formula of argonautic primal pulsation from relevant cosmic functions. They will be given in a different context. C. The west-east movement of the atmospheric argon envelope. The west-east direction in the motion of the atmospheric argon energy has great significance independent of the special variations that appear in the wave motion and in the pulses. The west-east direction is in agreement with the direction of rotation of the Earth's sphere, thus, it is also in agreement with the general direction of rotation in the planetary system. A reversal of this generally valid direction on the Earth's surface takes place only before thunderstorms or heavy rain occurring to the west of the observer. The following diagram illustrates the reversal of direction in the movement of the argon energy envelope. This reversal can be explained without contradiction by the attraction exerted upon the freely moving argon energy at R by the highly concentrated argon in the clouds to the west. To the west of the thundercloud no reversal will take place, since the attraction will act in the same direction as the general motion of the argon envelope. It is hard to state definitely whether or not the strong west-easterly wind, which often arises after the clearing of the sky, i.e., after the return of the west-east direction of argon motion, is a consequence of the filling of the gap, and Langley, and Wrangle that arose because of the reversal at R. 3. Visibility in the dark, autogenous illumination, a room of at least 6 feet square, made completely light-tight and lined with sheet metal on the inside, is required to observe the argon energy phenomena in the dark. After about 15 to 30 minutes adaptation, the room appears bluish-gray and not black. Slow-moving, fog-like formations are clearly discernible. The longer we sit in the dark metal room, the more distinct the light phenomena become. After some time, bluish-violet, strongly illuminating light points appear. Later, when our organism has excited the argon energy in the room to a sufficient extent, a concentration sets in the foggy formations, rapid, yellowish-white, lightning-like streaks of light, strike-strahlen, cross the room in all directions. We can magnify these whitish rays by observing them against an opaque, plastic screen with a magnifying glass, 4x, 6x. For a more detailed description of darkroom phenomena, I refer the reader to Chapter 4 of my book The Discovery of the Argon, Volume 2, The Cancer Biopathy. For change of form in 1939, when I first discovered and observed the argon illumination in the darkroom, I believed that argon energy consisted of 3 distinct forms: bluish-gray, fog-like formations, deeply blue-violet illuminating dots, and whitish, rapid rays. Since then, these three forms have been found not to be distinct types of argon energy, but three forms of one and the same energy under different conditions. Argon energy changes from the fog-like to the ray-like condition when it is excited or irritated. Such excitation can be stimulated by a metallic substances. Metal does not hold or absorb argon energy, but reflects it rapidly, thus constituting an obstacle, if such a mechanistic term is applicable at all in the realm of argon functions, i.e., ether functions. b. Living organisms. In the metal-enclosed darkroom, the organismic argon energy apparently excites the atmospheric argon energy and vice versa. c. Electromagnetic, discontinuous field action. An induction coil system will speed up the change from the fog-like to the ray-like formation quite considerably in 20 minutes instead of the customary 1 to 2 hours. Every type of condition and form is mobile, dynamic,